This podcast is brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and ramdas.org. Hi, I'm Raghu Marcus. As many of you know, Ram Dass partnered with Timothy Leary to help create the psychedelic movement of the late 60s. In his quest, Ram Dass was looking for a map of consciousness, a map that would answer all of life's big questions. Who am I, being one of the biggest? What am I doing here? What is this culture that I'm living in the midst of? And so when psychedelic This podcast is brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and ramdas.org. Hi, I'm Raghu Marcus. As many of you know, Ram Dass partnered with Timothy Leary to help create the psychedelic movement of the late 60s. In his quest, Ram Dass was looking for a map of consciousness, a map that would answer all of life's big questions. Who am I, being one of the biggest? What am I doing here? What is this culture that I'm living in the midst of? And so when psychedelics did not totally do it for him, he went to India to find the map. What he found was an enlightened being who knew everything about him and saw him as no one had seen him before, that is, without judgment and only with love. It was Ram Dass's first experience of unconditional love. This podcast is brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and ramdas.org. Hi, I'm Raghu Marcus. As many of you know, Ram Dass partnered with Timothy Leary to help create the psychedelic movement of the late 60s. In his quest, Ram Dass was looking for a map of consciousness, a map that would answer all of life's big questions. Who am I, being one of the biggest? What am I doing here? What is this culture that I'm living in the midst of? And so when psychedelics did not totally do it for him, he went to India to find the map. What he found was an enlightened being who knew everything about him and saw him as no one had seen him before, that is, without judgment and only with love. It was Ram Dass's first experience of unconditional love. Now, when Ram Dass came back to America, he toured the country sharing that experience and speaking the words that would become the book, Be Here Now. Of course, before he left India, his guru told him, do not say a word about me, and that's all he did when he came back. Now, at that time, I was the program director of a major alternative rock station in Montreal, Quebec. As far as spirituality was concerned, all I knew about was the Hare Krishna people at the airport, but I had seen a picture of an Indian saint named Meher Baba, and underneath were the words, "Don't worry, be happy." Well, I dug that. That made real sense to me. That was the beginning of something making sense. So one day I received a call from a promoter asking me to get the station to promote a lecture by a man named Ram Dass. I had no idea of a Ram Dass, but then he told me that it was Richard Alpert. Did I not know Richard and Tim? Of course, I loved them, and so I asked the promoter to send me a previous lecture of this Ram Dass, and I would let him know if we could support the evening. The tape was sent to me that day, and I went into the studio. Everything I had been needing to hear about how all this works for years and years of thinking about this stuff. Suddenly, clarity. But it wasn't just the words. It was the presence of the voice, the idea that I could be happy. Suddenly, everything made way more sense. So I played Ram Dass lectures day after day on that rock and roll station, and the response was incredible. People had never heard anything like this before. And in fact, when I finally did make it to India, there were some people from Montreal who had heard these lectures and got turned on and made their way there, and we have been close ever since. So here is a bit of what we heard back then.
The wild geese who do not intend to cast their reflection, and the water has no mind to receive their image. That was the first message I got from the first fortune cookie I opened when I returned from India. And it seems like a fitting contract for these meetings. And perhaps the full implications of that contract will become clear as the afternoon continues. What I'd like to do is to present a model to you and the specific model is my own life experience. That's really all I have to offer to you on my own experience. And I would like to clarify the reason for doing this. It is not my expectation or my hope that any of you necessarily would undergo the particular journey that I am pursuing. I am not proselytizing for Ashtanga yoga. But we in the West are faced with a very interesting predicament through a variety of circumstances, some of which are built into the culture, like changes in communication, media, and so on. Some of them are the result of the chemicals that have appeared and been widely used, psychedelics. Some of them are personal experiences people have had which previously they kept hidden, but now they begin to redefine, or they've hidden them under labels the society provided them, which made them seem like psychosis or insanity or something. And they now reconsider them. As a result of all these circumstances, many people in the West, including me, and I assume you, and that must be what's bringing you here, appreciate the possibility of states of consciousness other than our normal waking state of consciousness. Or maybe you're here just because you look at the world in which you're living and you say, well, we obviously can't handle it with what we've got going, so I'll at least look for something else, even though you may not have the faith and the possibility that there is something else, but you're going to look anyway. So we're presented with a possibility, and it filters through to us from one source or another that there is a very ancient tradition of people who have realized other states of consciousness and have sent messages and made maps. But the problem that we have as Westerners is that we can't understand the maps. The maps are there. The secrets are not secrets in the sense of, I'm not going to tell you. They're secrets in the sense that we can't hear. Jung, in his writings in the book by Wilhelm called The Secret of the Golden Flower, it's a eulogy to Wilhelm. He commends Wilhelm for having the courage as a Westerner to give up his predispositions of thought, to be able to get into that position from which he could appreciate the Eastern writings from an inside point of view. In other words, give up his identity as a Westerner. The term that you may be familiar with that's required is what's called surrender. And so what we can do for one another as Westerners is collect the data that are available to each of us as we open ourselves to them. We are all on a journey. We are, just as Hermann Hesse talks about, the fellow travelers on our journey to the East. East not being literal necessarily, but metaphorical. And what we can do is we can help each other along. We can be the satsang, the sangha, the spiritual community, the support for one another, giving each other the confidence to keep pursuing this possibility. And we give each other our own lives to help, and that's what I would like to do today, is to present, as I say, the model, because maybe there'll be some clues in it that will be of some use to you in your own sadhana, in your own spiritual journey. But in doing this, I am going to work on myself throughout this whole afternoon, as I'm always doing my mantra, japa, and therefore I'm really not speaking, I should tell you, and I hope you aren't listening. Because the place where I am, and I hope you are, is the same place, where we together are witnessing one of us speaking and the rest of us listening. But let's not get trapped in our social roles. Okay? It's a good exercise. Now, the reason that my life may be useful, although from most other standpoints it seems, even to me, quite trivial, is that I have he led 3 lives. I have 3 chapters, each of which is led quite naturally into the next, although at the time it didn't seem very natural. The first chapter was that of being a social scientist. The second was that of being a explorer in the psychedelic community. And the third is that of being a student of Ashtanga Yoga. And I'm going to take you through my trip to show you why each of those transformations occurred as best as I can. In 1961, in the fall of 61, I was at the height of my academic career. I had obtained my PhD from Stanford in psychology, and through a more charm than scholarship, I will admit, I had obtained a assistant professorship at Harvard, and a number of research grants, and a role as a therapist at the health service. And at the time I had research contracts at Yale and Stanford, and I was on leave from Harvard and teaching at the University of California at Berkeley. So I had 4 major universities cornered. And in the academic ladder, that's climbing pretty fast. I was 28. And I was being groomed for all kinds of things, right? I was definitely on my way up. Now, as a result of working these 70 hours a week, I was amassing a lot of money. And I was using this money to live as a cosmopolite or a bachelor under these circumstances. Mine, I had an apartment filled with antiques and a Mercedes-Benz and a Cessna airplane and a Triumph motorcycle and a MG sports car and a sailboat, and I went to the Caribbean skin diving, and I, you know, that kind of life, and I was an empire builder, very simply. That's the best way I labeled myself. Well, with it all, although it looked awfully good on paper, there was something wrong inside about it. I don't think I'm yet ready to be able to label, because I'm probably not free enough to be able to have objective understanding of it. To be able to label what really didn't feel right. I can give you some clues about what didn't feel right. One of the problems was I was teaching these very hip courses at Harvard. I was teaching Freud and human motivation, personality development, and clinical psychology. And all of these students would come seeking my wisdom. And the problem was that I knew I didn't know. I mean, I knew everything you had to know in order to be a professor of psychology at Harvard. But when you got down to the nitty-gritty of what had something to do with people's lives, I knew that it all didn't add up right, because I had these various roles. I was a researcher studying child development, and so I could see how the variables we were working with didn't quite get to what that kid was all about. Then I was a therapist, and so many hours a week I had somebody sitting on the other side of the desk, and he was playing patient, I was playing doctor, and I would sit and I'd run through my list of theories as he would run through his list of symptoms, and we'd compare them and match them up, and you know, it wasn't enough. It didn't quite gel. It was as if psychology had a reason to be as defensive as it was. Because as if behaviorism hadn't quite gotten hold of the critical variables in the human experience. And I looked around, I looked at my colleagues, my psychological and psychiatric colleagues, and they seemed to be really just about as neurotic as anybody else. And they would come and they would be psychologists from 9 to 5, and then they would go home, and they seemed to be roughly as hung up in their marriages. Their children seemed to be as destructive as other people's children. They seemed to show the same personality manifestations. And it seemed a fair question that if all of these theories were so good and these people were the masters of them, why wasn't it reflected in their own human behavior? Now, I had really tried. I had gone through 5 years of psychoanalysis, and most people hide behind that and say, well, it was a didactic analysis. That is, I did it so that I could help others. It's a teaching thing. I didn't do it. I did it because I was neurotic, and I paid because I was sick and I wanted to get well, because I knew that I wasn't making it in the world the right way, even though all the credits were, you know, the byline had all the credits. But at the end of 5 years of psychoanalysis, it was apparent that since I knew a lot about Freud and could keep pointing out to my analyst where he was making misinterpretations on the basis of a 1906 paper or something like that, that my defenses were at least as strong as his tools. That's all that's all that roughly $25,000 demonstrated to me. I hope those of you that are invested in those particular professional roles will appreciate that I'm probably still merely acting out my negative transference. And as far as the other things in my life, if you take the motorcycle, when I first got the motorcycle, I loved to climb hills with a motorcycle and do hill climbing races and things. And go roaring off into the night in the California hills at 95 miles an hour with a girl holding onto the back and the wind blowing and holding on for dear life. And there was a thrill. There was something that was very great. And it would, at the moment, there would be a moment when it would just feel, just that place would feel good inside. That was about one moment. Then all the rest of the time it was cold, you know, or it was rainy. And so after the newness wore off, the motorcycle sat in the garage, and the airplane sat out the landing strip, you know, because after a while, each of the things, the possibilities of each of those vehicles for giving me that thing I was looking for inside had been explored. And they were very finite, and I had appreciated what their limits were. Now, it was at this time that, just as this, I was settling into working for my tenure. That is, I was told, if you get your publications in order, we're holding a chair for you. Which meant, you know, publish or perish. Get those books out. Look good on paper. And so I was doing just that. And although it was a little discouraging to see that I already saw that this wasn't going to make it in life, and yet this was my commitment for the next 40 years or so. Now, I had a big corner office at Harvard with 2 secretaries and about 40 research assistants, and as I say, I was an empire builder. And down the hall, in a little closet-like place, there was this other guy who had come back from Italy, who had been riding a bicycle around Italy and had been found by the chairman of the department, who brought him back as the new bright thing for the department, and his name was Timothy Leary. And he was a fun-loving, drinking Irishman. And we were bachelors, and so we started to share evenings together, and he said he was going to Mexico in the summer, and I said that I'd like to come down too, and that we ought to take a trip across the north of South America in a little plane. And I told him I flew, which wasn't exactly true. I had a student license at the time. And he said, great, then we would meet in Cuernavaca on a certain date, and we would take off from there. So I then secretly went out and got my license. And then nobody would trust me with a plane, so I had to buy one. The bank bought it, actually. And off I went with the license 1 day old for this hair-raising trip, believe me, quite hair-raising trip over the mountains into into central Mexico. Well, when I got there, Tim had just had this experience in which he had taken the sacred mushrooms of Mexico, which he had gotten from a woman called Crazy Juana, a curandero up in the hills, who would put one in your hand and 2 in her mouth. And I heard many stories about what had happened to him in this experience. There weren't any more of the mushrooms around, and we didn't take the trip across South America. We just hung out down in Tepoztlan and Cuernavaca. And then we flew back to the United States together in the plane. his son and an iguana. And I went to Berkeley, so I couldn't do anything more. And he went back to Harvard to start exploring these chemicals, because he said he had learned more in this one experience than he had in all of his years as a psychologist. So when I came back to Harvard in the spring, I was quite eager to have this experience. And he had gotten hold of the synthetic of these called psilocybin. So on March 6th in 1961, it was the night of the biggest snowstorm of the year, and my parents' home was about 2 blocks away from Tim's big house. And I went to my parents to visit, and then I trudged through the snow and went over to Tim's house to turn on, which we did in the kitchen with a variety of assorted people in our usual highly controlled manner. And the first part of the experience had that certain unpredictability about it that Tim's son's dog had been out running in the snow and came in, and in our timeless minds it seemed like it was gasping for breath too long and we thought it was going to die. And it was by then 12 o'clock midnight Saturday night in a raging blizzard, and we imagined ourselves carrying this dog to the veterinarian 4 miles away, when we weren't even sure the dog, it wasn't just us. So we called his son down from upstairs to ask him to see how he would act with the dog. And he came down, the dog played with him, so we assumed everything was all right. And then I went off into the other room, and I was sitting in the living room by myself after all of this tragicomic, hallucinatory revelry. I was sitting in the semi-darkness. The light came in from the street. It was snowing, and it was very beautiful. And I was sitting there, and suddenly in the dark across the room, I saw a figure standing there. And as I looked more closely, I realized that the figure was myself. It was dressed in a cap and gown, strangely enough. And what I saw was my professorness across the room. It was what you'd call in psychology, what I called at that time, a dissociative experience. And so I looked at this professorness, and I said, well, it wasn't me any longer. I mean, I was here, and there was it. And I said, well, I guess I don't really need that anymore. And I sat back and relaxed. And the minute I said I don't need that anymore, the figure changed, and it was somebody else. And I sat forward, and there I was again, except now I was the young cosmopolite. My cosmopoliteness was sitting over there. All right, well, I guess I can do without that. Sat back. And in a sequence went by all of my social roles. Loverness, wise man, kind person, all of my roles. And each one, okay, well, too bad about that one, there it goes. And then went by Richard Alpertness. Now, this was another matter, you see. This was who I learned to be way back then, and I wasn't at all sure what happened when you gave that up. And I went through my mind the thought, what have I taken with this drug this madman Leary has given me? See, it's already his fault. And what's clearly going to happen now is that I'm going to be an amnesia case, because I'm losing my identity. I won't know who I am. All right, well, I can always get another social identity. I went through this thought process. I'll give up Richard Alpertness. At least I have my body. But as those of you that have experimented in this world know, I had spoken prematurely. Because as I looked down at the couch, nothing below my knees was visible any longer. And as I watched slowly, it all disappeared until it was only the couch. on which I was sitting. Now, the kind of panic I experienced at that time has been reported usually in the tabloids as the dire consequences of irresponsible use of psychedelic chemicals. Because there was nothing in my model of the universe that led me to believe that if I was not in my body, there would be anything left. So as far as I was concerned, I was dying or ceasing to exist. That was it. And I recall the feeling. I recall the adrenaline flowing. I recall the sweat breaking out. I recall wanting to scream out for help. I recall all those feelings. And as the panic was mounting in whatever it is that it was mounting in, since I wasn't seeing anything, obviously, a voice inside of me said very quietly and rather jocularly, it seemed to me, in view of the gravity of the situation, but who's minding the store? Right? And I became aware at that moment that although everything by which I knew myself was gone, still there was something in me that was watching this whole process disappear. There was what I at the time was calling a scanning device or a point of awareness, something in there that had no reference to body, no reference to personality, no reference to any of my social roles, and yet there it was, clear and lucid and watching the whole thing and just, watching it all happen. And the minute I defined it or labeled it or named it, I experienced a tremendous exhilaration, a tremendous feeling of liberation. And I remember jumping up and I ran out of the snow and danced in the snow. And then later I recall going back through the drifts to my parents' home around 5 in the morning and deciding as a young tribal buck that I would shovel the snow in the front. And I was shoveling and my parents came to the window and opened the window and said, "You damned idiot, come in, you don't shovel snow in the middle of the night." And I looked up and I heard this voice, which was the kind of voice of external sanction to which I had always responded, since that's how I got to be where I was. And I listened to the voice inside, and the voice inside says, "It's cool if you want to shovel snow. It's all right. Nothing immoral about that. It's all right." And I looked up at them, and I smiled, and I danced a bit of a jig, and I went back to shoveling. And the window closed, and I saw them smiling behind it. Well, now I was presented with a peculiar dilemma. Because the next Monday, when I had to get up and give my lectures in human motivation, the theory of ego psychology, which I was expected to present as a responsible member of the psychological community, I saw was not adequate to the experience that I had had. Because that place that I had gone to, I couldn't find it in the book. I couldn't find it in the book anywhere. Freud's unconscious had too much to do with the uniqueness of the individual and too much to do with personality qualities. Even Jung's collective unconscious wasn't quite the place, as I later explored more carefully. And I couldn't find the words to tell anybody about what had happened. And I hid behind what we all got to use quite frequently. This was an ineffable experience. Right? I'd like to tell you about it, but it's ineffable. Sorry.
This podcast has been brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and ramdas.org. We appreciate all the support for the foundation and for Ram Dass's work, and we hope that you will continue that support. You can go to ramdas.org and click on the This podcast is brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and ramdas.org. Hi, I'm Raghu Marcus. After meeting Ram Dass and spending time with him at his father's farm in New Hampshire, he told me he'd be going back to India to see his guru. Of course, I saw that as my opportunity to tag along, but he gave me a no on that one and said, let's exchange addresses and write when I got to India. So off I went at 25 years old to the land of the Himalayas and a 5,000-year-old civilization. You might say I was a little anxious. Now, while meeting Ram Dass at the radio station in Montreal, I was introduced to a woman from India that came from a family of devotees of a famous saint. She offered to take me to India and host me, and I thought, great idea. I was supposed to meet her there and go on a pilgrimage. I arrived in Bombay, or Mumbai as it's now called, and I noticed that the airlines were on strike. So I went to the train station, which had about 3 million people jostling in some chaotic, freaky dance with cows and monkeys meandering in and out. I had no idea that this was a daily event, but it freaked me so much that I decided to hire a car to take me on a
The external story is not particularly interesting, and that's been covered well by the Saturday Evening Post. The internal story is what I want to talk to you about, because from that point on, I changed the whole course of my actions. First, I tried to find ways within the system, within the establishment, within the scientific community, to work with these things, to work with the concepts or the variables that I was arriving at. We started to work with game theory and the game model and tried to conceive of that non-game point, which is not a point of action, from which you observe or you are aware of the roles, rules, rituals, language, and strategy, and so on that are involved in games. And Tim was applying this in the prisons, and I was applying it in the school systems. And I was teaching in junior high school a HIP counseling course for the Newton 8th grade kids in the Newton school system based on game theory, or how to change your own behavior through an analysis of your own social games. Do-it-yourself kit for behavior change. And then, because I realized there was something that was quite nonverbal about it, into the Lexington school system, I had introduced karate. Not as karate, I mean, the parents wouldn't go for that, but the kids subtly knew it was, and we called it on the paper Methods of Eastern Exercise. And I was teaching the kids, or I had the karate instructors teaching the kids how to focus on a point and clear their mind in order to be able to be aware of all the stimuli around them, all of which was helping them become free of their entrapment in moment-to-moment stimuli from the outside. Well, as you all know, it was all too hot to handle, and I got thrown out of Harvard, and we continued our work in a variety of communities in Mexico, the Caribbean, Millbrook, Newton. I went on to California. Now, in the course of the next 6 years, to be quite brief about it, I ingested LSD or mescaline or peyote or aliuqui or DMT or DET or STP or whatever else I can recall at the moment. Whatever was offered to me, I took. Something in excess of probably 300 times. And I still came down. No matter how many times I went up, I always came down. It was as if I would go to the doorway, I would look in, and maybe for a brief moment I would be able to experience this other kind of consciousness. And I'd always think, well, now I've got it forever. I'll never have to go back to that place. I remember vividly one experience in the meditation room in Newton, where I had taken a very sizable dose of LSD, and I was alone, and I had meditated for many hours, fasted and so on, and I went into a state of samadhi for a timeless period. I think it was probably about 2 hours, but I don't know, because it didn't have much. Time is not a variable in that state. And then I remember starting to come out of it. And what I saw was, coming down the room, a huge blood-red wave rolling towards me, like an ocean wave, and in it were all the components of my identity. I saw myself on a tricycle as a little boy, I remember vividly. I saw all of these different images of different takes getting out of the bathtub, or, you know, any moment when I'd ever been conscious in my life. It was like a Hieronymus Bosch painting. That's the feeling it had. And I remember holding my arms up to ward it off and saying, no, I don't want to go back into that. And it was as if I realized at that moment I didn't have the key, I didn't have the leverage to be able to avoid going back into that thing. I didn't seem to be able, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to recite to keep this demon from, you know, taking me over again. And I felt it roll in over me, and then I was back as in my social identity. Now, I tried everything. I got together with 4 other people, and we locked ourselves in a house for 3 weeks, and we took LSD, 400 micrograms of LSD every 4 hours for 3 weeks. That's like 2,200 micrograms a day. And it was a ball. We had a wonderful time for 3 weeks, I'll tell you. We did all kinds of sculpture and metal welding and painting, and we had many internal mind trips together, and at the end of the 3 weeks, when we came out of the house, we all came down. Right. Now, it isn't that I wasn't changing all this time. A lot was going on. Each of these, see, I did a lot of what you call programmed trips. That is, I would work with a chemical to design a plan for an experience in order to confront me with certain stimuli to get me to change my habits of thought about that particular thing. Because I knew that that was what was involved. It was changing one's whole cognitive map, if you will. But there was a very subtle quality, a problem involved in here, and it had been pointed out to me by none other than an Eastern mystic by the name of Meher Baba, who during a period of time I had become very devoted to. And the story of Meher Baba, I can briefly tell that my part of it is this, that I was living with Steve Durkee and his wife and child and Jane Burton and her baby, and we were in a community in California, in a big house in Los Altos. Steve is a mystic artist. Steve and Barbara were from the USCO group here in the East with Gerd Stern, and they all were followers of Meher Baba. And we were all living in Los Altos, taking LSD together. And Meher Baba sent a message through a boy that went to visit him. He was silent, and he held up his hand and he went, nay, meaning stop smoking that horrible stuff. So the message came back, Meher Baba said to stop smoking that horrible stuff. Well, I interpreted that as, well, he's telling this young hippie, whoever he is, that it's not good for him. It has nothing to do with me. And then the next thing I heard was that Meher Baba had sent somebody back to the United States, in fact, this fellow, to tell all of the Baba lovers to stop taking LSD and stop having anything to do with anybody who took LSD. Well, now this raised a peculiar problem for us in our home, because Steve and Barbara were followers of Meher Baba, and I was one of the LSD people, as we were called, and we were going to have to break up the community in order to adhere to his directions. So I wrote Meher Baba a letter It's a strange thing to write a letter to somebody who says, I am God, I am the avatar, but I took courage in hand, and I wrote and I said, Maya Baba, here is my problem, which you undoubtedly already know, but I'll tell it to you on paper anyway. I read your books, and they all speak to me from way inside myself. I know they're all true. It all feels absolutely right. The only reason I know that is because of these drugs. Therefore, how can I, with any integrity, put them down, since they brought me to you? Would you please tell me how to do this? So he wrote back, and he said, in effect, for a few serious students like yourself, these chemicals may be slightly helpful. You may take them 3 more times, and then you should stop. I thought that was very funny, but the other thing he said was, he said, the problem is that one gets addicted to the experience. Not addicted to the drug, addicted to the experience. What I now would call, you get trapped in your upaya. You get trapped in your method. And the person who says, well, I'll just take it once more to go back to that place, maybe this time I can stay, already knows he's not going to be able to stay this time. And he knows, just like I knew, that somewhere inside of himself is a little voice saying, which is the drug and which is me? Although he's putting down anybody that's saying, man, it's all hallucination, and you ought to settle down and live in reality, because he already knows that it... See, the drugs did the major thing for me, is they broke through my limited reality that I had considered absolute reality, like this is the way the world is. And it introduced me to relative reality, so I could get outside a particular perspective and see that there were other realities as well. I got into relative values, relative perspective, relative reality. The next step, as I'm going to tell you about in a moment, takes you the next step, which goes behind the relative realities to, again, to an absolute reality, to a capital T truth, which science, of course, says there isn't. And it was true that I was addicted to the experience. Because when I would come back into this consciousness, it was as if I just didn't have the effectiveness, the free energy, the powers of consciousness, the understanding of the universe that I had when I was under these chemicals. And therefore I used these chemicals anytime I would be required to perform at a very high level of consciousness, which made it very difficult to go out on lecture tours and keep from getting busted. Whoever hears this. Okay. 1966, 7, 2 things happened. One is a mounting degree of despair in me. It's not what you would call drug depression by any means. I realize that these drugs are just what we always thought they were. They are the powerful vehicle that show the possibility. But I realize that we don't know enough to figure out how to use them. And nobody else seems to either. I mean, everybody you talk to, we were talking to the people who supposedly knew. And none of them had a model which would allow us to really stay in these situations. The other thing that happened to me was that I had been invited as one of the initial people before it was released into the market to experiment with this chemical called STP. And the dosage I was given turned out to be about twice as large as is feasible to work with. And it had put me into a strange, timeless glass-encased booth for about 3 days, during which I had to deliver a lecture at a university, since I had not expected that the chemical was going to last that long. And I was delivered to this university and onto the lectern, and onto the platform. And I took a microphone in hand, and this voice spoke through me, and I proceeded to give a lecture. And at the end of the lecture, there was a very curious reaction on the part of the audience, because when the lecture was all over, nobody moved. And I said, well, that's all, everybody. Nothing happened, nobody moved. And then people came up, and they stood around, and nobody said anything. They just stood there. I stood there, and they stood there. I'm giving you a behaviorist description of it now. And a friend of mine that was there said that the people that had just come out of curiosity, who couldn't appreciate or accept the feelings that I was projecting, had become so uptight and angry that she said it was the first time she ever feared for my physical safety at a lecture. That these people would have physically hurt me if they could have, because I got to something in them so deep. Well, I sensed at that point that whatever else these chemicals were, they had opened something in me that I wasn't the least bit ready to be responsible for, since I didn't think I was a responsible enough being to be in this position of whatever was being called out here. It was like you were handing a jet controls to a child. I mean, you know, it's insane to give me those kind of powers when I was so power hungry, as my previous life had demonstrated. And so I canceled all my lectures at that point, deciding I couldn't really afford to speak anymore since I didn't know what was going on. Now, the final thread bringing you to the third part of the story is that in the early 60s, when we first started to work on this with people like Aldous Huxley and Gerald Hurd and many advisors and wise friends, they had brought to our attention many Eastern books as being relevant, and the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was a manual used in Tibet to prepare people, read by monks to a person as he was dying, to prepare him to die and go through the 49 days before reincarnation, through the bardos. That when we looked over that book was almost at times frighteningly parallel to the psychedelic experience. And therefore, Tim conceived of and pretty much did on his own the translation of Evans Wentz translation of the Tibetan book into a manual for working with the psychedelics. We tried to conceive of the psychedelic experience as a psychological death-rebirth experience, since my own first experience was such a death experience, as I pointed out to you. And following that, we read a number of books which had led us to believe that the information that we needed to know to socialize these chemicals to be able to work with these higher states of consciousness was known in the East by somebody at some time or other. And so various of us went to India to look, find these guys. You know, go find one of them. And everybody came back with the same report. Well, I guess there aren't any around. They're all gone. And it got frighteningly clear that there might be a possibility that we knew as much as anybody knew that was alive, and we didn't know. right? And that was a very unpleasant feeling to have, because that made it all a little too irresponsible, whoever was planning it. Well, in beginning of '67, I had used up all my alternatives. I had seen that the LSD, the way I understood it, wasn't going to take me where I wanted to go. There was no sense in continuing just to turn on, because I knew I would go to this wonderful place, and that was a groove, but that wasn't enough. And I didn't know what to do next. And I couldn't really, I read all these books from the East, but they didn't do it for me. The words were, they were all that foreigner stuff. I was in the ethnocentric predicament. Well, I finally decided that I would go to India and look for myself. Maybe they'd overlooked a holy man hanging out somewhere. And I had a friend, David Padua, who's a very intellectual, extraordinary fellow, and who has retired at 35 after being very successful in his undertakings. And so he arranged for a Land Rover to be delivered to Tehran, and we started our journey from Tehran, Iran, in search of the Sufis, which were the mystics of Islam. And we searched out Sufis, and all we found was one Sufi about 92 who was blind and was very sweet and gentle and surrounded by very lovely people, but nothing happened. I mean, the way you get to know is somewhere in here. There's nothing they're going to say to you. There's nothing they're going to... they don't have a badge or a credential or anything. It's just you're going to feel that something happened. And then we went on through Afghanistan, which is an extraordinarily beautiful country. And in a haze of extraordinarily fine charas, hashish, went on through India. Went to see the Dalai Lama. Dharamsala had his audience, darshan. Got horses and went up to Amarnath Cave up in Kashmir, a religious pilgrimage of many days, with some beautiful girls we'd met. Meeting these holy men along the way who we'd exchange a pipe with, we'd enjoy a pipe together, all smiling at one another. But I didn't know. It was a big cave and it was lovely. It was a nice horse ride. But nothing happened inside me. And then we went to Benares, the holy city where the burning ghats are, and that scared me very much because there were all these old people waiting to die. And I took LSD and walked down the streets and was afraid to look any of them in the face because they were all so much there, and I still had traveler's checks. I was holding back. I was playing my game. Well, on we went for 3 months or so, and my despair was increasing. And we got to Kathmandu, Nepal, and we had had a delightful journey. I mean, it was really delightful as journeys go. We had our guide, our friend and companion was Harish Johari, who was a very, very fine Indian sculptor, the son of a yogi, a very gentle, beautiful person who understands Indian music from the most delicate point of view. And he was just a fine person to be with. Well, there we were in Kathmandu, Nepal, and we were then going on to Japan. At the time, we were going to join Alan Watts in Kyoto. And I was really depressed. It might have been all the hashish I had smoked, but I don't think it was just that. What it was in addition was the feeling that I had looked and nothing had happened. I didn't find anything. We were staying at a very fancy hotel owned by the Prince of Nepal, the Sawalti. And one day David and I walked into the square, and we were sitting in a restaurant called the Blue Tibetan, which is a hippie hangout. Sitting with some beautiful young French hippies. Now, I had been going around India giving LSD to holy men. You see, I was hoping to find out what LSD was, or maybe get some clues as to what to do with it, by finding, say, an old Theravadan monk, or a Kajipa Lama, or a Shaivite sadhu, and I would say, I'd explain, through a translator or whatever vehicle we had, and they could they try it? Yeah, here it is, and and some of them, there were some of these holy people who, oh wow, isn't this a ball? This is just great. And others said it gave me a headache, and others said, well, it's not as good as meditation, and others, they gave as much variability as any Western subject sample would do. And the problem was that in each of them, I felt ego. In other words, I didn't get a feeling from any of them that they were themselves realized beings. They were all on the journey. They were all looking. They all had their little handout for the pills so fast that I knew they were still looking, if you know what I mean. So we're sitting in the Blue Tibetan, and in walks this very unusual looking fellow. He's a Westerner, he's from the United States, young fellow. Perhaps he's so unusual because he's very tall, he's 6'7", long beard, long hair, blonde hair, looks a little like Christ, white cloth, barefoot. Walked in, and very commanding type person, young looking. Walked right over to our table and sat down. And we all continued to talk, and he said a few things. And David and I sensed almost immediately that this fellow was very, he was a Westerner, yes, and all the hippies were dressed in holy robes of one sort or another. So that wasn't unusual. But there was something about this guy that was different from all these others. There was something that felt different. So we sort of collared him and brought him back to our hotel, sort of as a, something to, we'd examine him. And it's tough sneaking those people through the lobby of these fancy hotels. But we got up into our suite, and then we had about 5 days of sort of a seminar made up of charas and peach melvas and hot baths and Alexandra David Neal books and Richard Avedon books, Arthur Avedon. And LSD. And the deeper we all got into, there were the four of us, this Indian sculptor, David, who's really a Buddhist at heart, or in mind, or in mindlessness, although still very much caught in the world of the external world, but sees what the possibility is, intellectually. Extraordinary intellect. He went to college when he was 14, and he had his international law degree when he was 20, and, that kind of person. And this tall fellow and me. And as the days went on, it became apparent that while all the rest of us were still looking at one level or another, this tall guy knew. There was a different feeling. Inside, there was somebody in there. There was something very certain. You didn't feel that he was reaching so hard. You still felt his personality, but it was a different quality about it, something different. And he knew an awful lot about a lot of things. He had left the United States when he was 17 years old. He just finished high school, and he an extraordinary guitarist. He thumbed his way across the United States, went on a freighter to Rotterdam, and then playing his guitar all the way across Africa and Egypt and Israel and all, came to India. He knew he was home, and he had been initiated into a number of different sects, and he had been in India for 4 years then. And he knew a great deal,
This podcast has been brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and raamdass.org. We appreciate all the support for the foundation and for Ram Dass's work, and we hope that you will continue that support. You can go to raamdass.org and click on the Donate Now button and follow the prompts. Thank you. This podcast is brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and disappointment. But after another day of traveling through intense, choked towns, reeking of a combination of toxic waste and the perfume of flowers and incense, we arrived in Pondicherry, a French colony seaside town from the 18th century. Very exotic and very enchanting, and the home of another saint, Sri Aurobindo, and his sidekick, called simply Mother. And so it was here that my spiritual story really began.
So when it came time for us to leave for Japan, I didn't really want to go, because this was the first guy that was the spark of the light that I was looking for, but it seemed absurd that I would come, 6,000 miles or something like that, and on this journey to find a 23-year-old guy from Laguna Beach. I mean, it just, it was very hard just from altering one's expectations. And so I got to this choice point of going on with David first class, the rest of our survey of the Eastern Oriental Mind, the Oriental Mind survey, or going off with this tall fellow who was going to go on a religious pilgrimage in India, back into India. Well, I chose to go with him. Well, that was quite a drastic experience for me. I've always had kind of a soft life. And I suddenly found myself walking out of Calcutta barefoot. He had given away all of my stuff. He had taken over all of my money. Most of it he had given away already. I had a shoulder bag and a little Tibetan drum. And my feet were all blistered. Previously, I had been in the Land Rover where we had a big suitcase full of enteroviaform and oreomycin and all of these nice things. And now my shoulder bag had a tube of Johnson First Aid Cream and 2 Band-Aids. That was my whole equipment. And previously, we were drinking bottled this and going to American-style restaurants. And now I was eating from street vendors, and so the dysentery was quite extraordinary, in which case he would say to me, well, a fast would be good, right? I mean, he was compassionate, but there was no pity, right? No pity. He wasn't climbing into the Western, you know, what, here, lie down. Blisters, well, we'll walk slower. That's quite a thing for him to walk, because the streets, you see, because cows are sacred, the cows leave their dung, and before they're picked up and made into fuel, they're hanging around, and then all these people are chewing pan in India and spitting the pan juice. And I had come out of, you know, excessively good toilet training. And to walk, I was so exhausted from the end of the day of having to see where I was walking. And his big feet were just padding along like a camel, you know, and he was looking every other way, and he was always stepping around all this stuff, and I could never figure it out, you know. Now, as we got out of the big cities, in the big cities, you know, people look at you like, what kind of a nut are you? Barefoot in a cloth. We know you're a Westerner, you know, like, who are you kidding? But as you get out in the villages, it's much purer in India, and they still respect the spiritual endeavor. And the people would call, hey, Babaji, which is Baba is means grandfather. It also means holy man. It's usually given to Vaishnavites, which is the white cloth, and so. And Babaji is sort of the affectionate title. In Yiddish, it would be Babala. It's that same thing. And so they call Babaji, and I would always be embarrassed, you know, because I wasn't a holy man. I was just wearing a white cloth. I was a Western intellectual, old, overage hippie, you know, looking to see what was going on in India. That's who I was in my head, you know, in my fixed model of myself. And we got to these caves at Baneshwar. We had gone to the Ramakrishna mission, which had not been a very spiritual experience, unfortunately, although the Ganga was very beautiful, quite fine. We had gone to the Sun Temple at Konarak, which was the use of sexual tantra, and very high temple, very extraordinarily beautiful temple. So we got to these caves at Baneshwar, these Buddhist caves in the rock, beautifully cut in the rock, almost by hand, very soft inside, little caves, maybe 30 or 40 of them. And it was empty now. And we thought, well, you know, we had come walking this long way, we would meditate in these caves for maybe an hour or so. And so I found a little cave way up on a ledge, and I went inside there, and I sat down, and it was a warm afternoon. I closed my eyes, and I sort of went off into a reverie, I guess you'd call it. Felt very calm, eyes closed, and I opened my eyes about 20 minutes later, and I noticed there was only the light from the door, that there was a pile right over by the door, and I assumed this pile was a pile of stones that since I came in from the bright light, I was not dark adapted. I must have stepped over and not seen. But I looked forward, and they were a pile of coins. See, religious pilgrims had passed, and they had seen this sadhu meditating. And because it is the responsibility of the grasta, or the householder in India, to support the holy men, they had left this money for me. And that really shook me up. So I talked to Bhagwan Das about it, the friend I was with. And we decided to give it away to a beggar. But I kept 1 paisa, because it was the first time that I found that it paid to be a holy man. And there was that much profaneness in me that I thought that. You appreciate that. At the same time, because it was too embarrassing to seriously consider myself a holy man, because my Western mind wouldn't give in that much. I mean, I know what kind of a hype religion is. You know, you're not going to catch me and coming on like one of those guys. See? That was my feeling. And Bhagwan Das said, look, he said, when people reverence you because of the role you're in, they are doing it, and it's helping their spiritual work to do this. And the way you can handle it, he says, the way I handle it, is I reverence them back. Because you're a holy man, you don't bow like they come out and they touch your feet. People run out from shops to touch your feet as you walk by. And you don't do that to them because you're in your role. But in your heart, you touch their feet, you reverence them. And he said, then you're offering them the blessing that they've come to receive, and it's one, you know, that which is pure in you offering to them. Okay, that was fair enough. I was willing to do that. Now, all along this journey, this fellow, this strange Westerner, is slowly taking me over my training, and my feeling during this period is as if I am a newborn baby. That's all I can describe it as. He's buying the food, he arranges for our sleeping things, he tells me when to get up, he tells me where we're going to go, he tells me where to sit, when to stand, how to go to the bathroom. He teaches me how to go to the bathroom like a Hindi. He tells me how to eat with my hand, you know. Left hand for that and right hand for that, and you know, don't mix them up or you'll lose a hand in the, you know, if you put it in the communal pot, wrong hand. And most interestingly, and he's teaching me about my body, and I'm losing weight, and I've got racked with dysentery and my bones all. We're sleeping on wooden tables everywhere, see, because he's a holy man, so he doesn't go to hotels. He doesn't go into restaurants, so you sleep where you sleep on the ground or you sleep on a wooden, you know. So all my hip bones are black and blue, and, you know, it's really painful, very, very painful. But besides the body thing that's happening, he's working with my thought process. So I'll say to him something like, how long do you think we're going to be on the road? And he'll say, don't worry about the future. Just live now. So we'd be silent for a while, sitting on our boards, our wooden tables, and I'd say to him, gee, this sure is strange in relation to the past. You know, when I used to, he'd say, don't think about the past. Just be here now. Well, man, my whole game, as you can see, I'm telling you about the past now. I mean, my whole lecturing routine, my whole social identity is either connected with the future or the past. You know, I'm just passing through the present. Time is the thing, very important. Where we're going to go with the psychedelics in the future. And all the interesting experiences I had in the past, and he didn't want to hear any of the interesting experiences. I mean, I was one of the most interesting people alive, and he didn't even want to know it. And then I'd say to him, gee, I feel lousy. And he'd say, think of feelings like waves in the ocean and watch them recede into the distance. So I'd take that lousy feeling and I'd make it into a wave and I'd push it off into the distance. And I'd say, boy, that makes me feel better. And he'd say, feelings are like waves. Take the feeling and make it into a wave and let it recede in the distance. But see, the positive ones had to go too. And then I had nothing to talk about, so then I was silent, you see. So there we were, just sitting together, you know. And he taught me how to work with a mala, do mantra. He taught me to sing bhajan. He said, fill your mind with good things, you know, praises of God, which I thought was a big joke, but okay, if that's the trip, I'll do it. Adaptive fellow. All right, we have a variety more experiences, which I won't belabor and fill you full of at this point, since they're more of the same, pretty much. And then, every place we go, there's somebody groovy to receive us, because he has many friends everywhere, and they all love him. That's pretty clear. And he's also, because he's an initiate of many sects, everybody knows him from something or other, and they're all like, there's some spiritual link with everybody we're meeting. So the situation arrives that I have my visa to extend, which I'm going to do for a couple of more months and then go on to Japan. So I go to Delhi with him to do this, and I get back into my horn-rimmed glasses and my pants and jacket, because I can function with the bureaucracy as, you know, Dr. Albert, collector of musical instruments for the University of New Mexico, the Museum of New Mexico, and I had letters of credentials and stuff like that. Well, I couldn't really cut it going in as a holy man to ask for a visa extension. And I got that, and then he had an annual visa to take care of, and his papers were in a city, some way from Delhi, and we went there by bus, and it turned out that he was going to have some difficulty, which is not unusual. Those of you that have dealt with the structure, the government structure in India. It's very, very loving. The Indians are beautiful, beautiful, wonderful people. It's just that they don't live in time the way we do. See, clues everywhere. Everywhere there's clues, but who sees them? These poor, unfortunate Indians, they haven't yet learned to live in time. We'll teach them. So Bhagwan Das says to me, well, he says, I'm having trouble. I got to go see my guru. Now, this is the first time that he's mentioned that he even has a guru to me. I figure, since we've been thinking about Buddhism and all, and the whole Hindu trip seems so like all those pictures of the pantheon they had. The colors were kind of gaudy, and the whole thing was a little too emotional for me, you know. The whole Hindu trip was too emotional, and the Buddhist thing was nice and pure and clean. And so I figured it must be a Buddhist Lama or something we're going to go see. I didn't know, he didn't say. And he says, we better go borrow the Land Rover, which was still in India, which the sculptor had, to go up into the mountains, since it's about 100 miles, and we're going to have to do it fast. And I didn't want to borrow that Land Rover because it's like the most expensive vehicle in India, and it puts you inside a big Western box, you know, and I was just enjoying getting out into India. I had just gotten over my panic of the pan juice and the droppings and, you know, and the whole eating from the vendors, and I didn't want to go back into that big box again. It was like, it felt bad. So I was a little uptight about that. But he said we'd do it anyway. So the night before we left the city, we were staying at this very palatial place of somebody who was following him around trying to get his blessing. I had to go to the bathroom during the night, and I went outside. Stars were all out. And I looked up at the stars, and I was thinking about my mother. Now, the previous January, my mother had died. This was now October. And she had died of a blood condition at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston. The blood condition was in her, not in the hospital. She had died of spleen. And I was standing out there, not thinking about how she died, but I was just thinking of her. I felt very close to her at that moment. It was like you get out in the universe and you feel close to things that you are spiritually linked to. And I thought about Mother now in time and, you know, and so on. Because I had taken LSD to go to her funeral, see, so I had not gotten hung up in the fact that we were burying Mother, right? And so I felt just as close to Mother as I'd ever felt to her. And so therefore it was not unnatural that I would think of her. Then I went back to bed, and the next day we went and we got the Land Rover and we went off to the mountains. And we came to this little temple by the side of the road, and people surrounded the car as they do everywhere. In India, it's what's called instant crowd. Every time you can stop in the desolate wastelands, and within 10 seconds, there's 200 people. You don't know where, it's just unbelievable how many people are. All smiling and loving and warm and looking and curious and no paranoia. I mean, they're really there. They're really, we aren't, but they are. They're infringing on our privacy. That concept doesn't exist in India. So we got out of the car at the temple, and Bhagwan Das asked, "Where's the Guru?" And they said, "The Guru is up in the hills, up in that hill over there, around the hill." And Bhagwan Das goes off at a lope, but all the way up into the hills, tears are streaming down his cheeks. And I know that we're getting close to something very powerful, but I don't know what it is. And I'm very bugged about the car, and I'm sulking in the corner, and, I've been smoking too much hashish. So I had stopped a few days before, but I was having the down effect one has after having smoked for a long time. We rush up the hill. I'm rushing behind him, trying to keep up with him, and I'm being ignored by everybody, and I'm just in terrible shape, really. Stumbling up this path, and we come out into this field, beautiful sunny day, overlooking a valley, and there's an old man sitting there with a blanket wrapped around him. Around him are about, 8 or probably 8 or 10 Hindu people sitting there. And we rush over, and Bhagwan Das does Danda Pranam, the full pranam, out flat on his stomach before this man. And he's crying, and the man's patting him on the head, and it's some kind of joyous reunion, and I'm standing by, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to touch this guy's feet, or, I don't know what to do. I've never seen a guru before. Thus far, all I had met in India were pundits. I met many wise men who knew the Upanishads and who quoted Ramakrishna and told me about Ramana Maharshi, but I didn't meet Ramana Maharshi, and I didn't meet Ramakrishna or their spirits, and I didn't meet anybody like them. So I had never met one of these real ones, and I assumed if he was crying this much, it must be somebody. But I was too angry to even care, to tell you the truth. And after a few minutes, this man looked up, and he looked at me. He smiled, and he said in Hindi to Bhagwan Das, "Have you a picture of me?" Bhagwan Das says, "Yes." He says, "Give it to him." Bhagwan Das said, "All right, I will." Then he looked at me, he says, "You came in a big automobile?" I said, "Yeah." "You'll give it to me?" Well, that really blew my mind. I mean, I wish I could have, but, so I said, "Well, it's not mine to give, and, you get me one like it?" So I thought, my God, I just got here and he's hustling me. I mean, what kind of a thing is this? What have I done to deserve this? Am I that bad a person that I got to be subjected? And was I self-pitying and paranoid. All the time he's laughing. See? He's laughing, he's putting me on. But I don't know that. Costs a lot of money, he says. "You make a lot of money in the United States?" So I used to. "You'll get me a car like that? It rides nice, huh?" He's just coming on to me, something fierce, right? Okay. And I'm really angry. But I'm suppressing it and answering pleasantly, and everybody's smiling at me, and I'm smiling at everybody. Then he says, "Take them for food." And they take us to a room, and they give us a big feast. These beautiful sadhus bring us food, the food that the women bring to the Guru each day as an offering. And we eat, and then a few minutes later, Bhagwan Das and I are together all the time, and he's the only one I've come with. And this is way up in the remote mountains. There's no electricity up here, nothing going, it's very remote. Call back to the guru and go back to him, and he says to me, he looks directly at me, right in my eyes, and he said, "You were out under the stars last night." Acha. You were thinking about your mother. Acha. Leaned back and then he said, "She died last year." Acha. He said, "She got very big in the stomach before she died." He said, "She died of spleen." He didn't ask. He said, "She died of spleen." Well, the only way I can describe what experience I had at that moment, and he looked at me with a twinkle at that point. Now, the only way I can describe what happened to me at that moment is to compare my rational mind to a computer that has been fed an insoluble problem. That the computer runs through all of the alternative resolutions of this problem that are in the storage units, and it runs off each of them in sequence, and I thought, well, does he have a telephone? Was Bhagwan Das away from me for a moment? Bhagwan Das doesn't even know my mother's dead. How is he going to, because he wasn't interested in my past. He doesn't know that. I've never said to, was he reading my mind? Was I thinking about it at this moment? What would that mean? And I went through, but I wasn't even thinking about it. I had even forgotten what she died of. I mean, the spleen, I hadn't even remembered the term of the organ. So the computer went and went and went, and then as computers do, when it finishes its analysis through the storage unit, a little red light goes on, and a bell rings, and it stops. And that is literally what happened to my rational mind at that point. I realized I'd just been overwhelmed. I mean, ego, Richard Alpert, had just been beaten. There was nowhere to hide. I wasn't high, so I couldn't say this was a drug hallucination. There was a guy doing this thing right to me right then, right, through my gross senses. Right? And at that moment, when that computer stopped, it was like a very severe pain in my heart. It was like a really wrenching feeling. And I started to cry. I wasn't crying because I was sad, and I wasn't crying because I was happy. The closest way I could describe it maybe is I was crying because I was home. I mean, because, yeah, right. Whew. Wow. That kind of feeling. Like I didn't have to do it anymore. It was all okay. But I kept crying and crying and crying, and they carted me off to another temple to rest for the night. Now I had no trouble at all touching his feet, whoever he was. Well, that night in the temple, I was very confused, and I would cry a lot, and I just was confused. I mean, that was just my state, was confusion. But I really felt like I had arrived somewhere. I mean, I felt this feeling that this man he knew what was inside of me completely. I just understood that he was part of me. I felt completely safe. And then the LSD went across my mind, and I thought, gee, it's interesting. I've been going around India giving LSD to all these people, asking them what they think, and they all have egos. Here's a guy, he's clearly, I don't feel any ego in this guy. I mean, he feels absolutely pure. I'll ask him what LSD is. He'll know. My Western mind doing its, I'm a scientist, I'm doing my thing. Next morning, message arrives, we're to go to the guru right away. We're taken to the guru, I go to see him, he looks at me, he says, Have you a question? That's like you walk up in front of the sun and you're completely luxuriating in the warmth of these rays. You're completely fulfilled. You're so satisfied. There's nothing that you want in life but just to stay at that moment. If you could call it a desire even, because you're even beyond that. You're just feeling that good. And he says, is there something you want? Well, there's nothing I want. I said, no, I don't. I got nothing to ask you. I'm happy. It's all right. I just want to be near you. He says, where's the medicine? So I said, what medicine? So he said, don't you have medicine that gives siddhis, meaning powers? Well, when it was translated for me, I didn't know the word siddhis at that time. It was translated as powers, and I thought here was an old man who must be getting weak and he wanted vitamins. So I said, no, I don't have anything. I don't have any vitamins. I wish I did, but I'm sorry I don't. So somebody says, no, he means the LSD. I said, LSD? Chai. Acha. Tika, LSD. Yes. So I went to the car and I brought the bottle of LSD back. He held out his hand. And I held up my hand. I poured all this stuff into my hand, and I had in there LSD and a little STP and a few tranquilizers and a couple of sleeping pills and a little of this and a little of that, as I was prone to do in those days. And I told him what each thing was, and then I put it all back in the bottle, and then he held out his hand. So I poured out one LSD pill. These are what are called in the underground world white lightning. They are 300 micrograms of quite pure LSD. He looked at it and, come on. So I poured a second one. That's now 600 micrograms. Come on. Or a third one, that's 900 micrograms. Well, now 900 micrograms is, for a man in his 70s, is, it's nothing I would have been a party to, I'll tell you that much. But he looked at it, smiled, threw it in his mouth, and I saw it go down. I saw him swallow it, right? So the scientist in me thought, well, this is going to be interesting. And I smiled, he smiled, and everybody smiled, and I didn't understand. I was still confused. I stayed around all that day, and of course you know the conclusion of the story, that nothing whatsoever happened to him. As I later understood, what he was doing was mirroring my desire about the drugs, just as he was mirroring my anger and uptightness about the car the day before. He's just a perfect mirror. He isn't anybody at all. He's nobody at all. The week before, an old sadhu had come by who takes arsenic in little doses. Arsenic is an aid to bhajan, to doing spiritual, devotional bhakti yoga. And many of the traveling sadhus use arsenic. And he had about a year's supply, which would be like a lethal dose for about 10 men. And the guru apparently had said, it was the week before, so I did not see this, but he said, where's the arsenic? He took it and he ate the whole thing. And everybody cried and wailed, and don't leave us, because see, it doesn't matter to him, I mean, he's not caught in his body, but everybody else is. And so all the devotees were all uptight that he was going to leave them. And of course, nothing happened.
This podcast has been brought to you by the Love Serve Remember Foundation and raamdas.org. We appreciate all the support for the foundation and for Ram Dass's work, and we hope that you will continue that support. you can go to raamdas.org and click on the Donate Now button and follow the prompts. Thank you.